It was one of those class trips you'd expect to see in a horror movie rather than the plan of an 8th grade class in a small town in Maine. The teachers had decided that a day trip to the abandoned island of Harper's Isle would be an exciting way for us to experience the local history and geography. The island, abandoned for more than 50 years, was once the site of a great fire that destroyed the entire colony. There were stories circulating that ghosts of the past still walked the island, but that didn't stop us. On the contrary, it only made us more excited. The morning dawned clear and cold as we, a group of 20 students along with 2 teachers, boarded the small boat that would take us to the island. The crossing was calm, the water as smooth as glass, which only added to the eerie silence. Emily, my best friend, whispered to me that she had a bad premonition. I laughed it off, reassuring her that it was just an adventure. How wrong I was. When we arrived, our teacher, Mr. Johnson, led us down a narrow path through dense undergrowth and overgrown ruins. The remains of the village were ghostly, half engulfed by the wild vegetation, and with every step you felt the weight of history. The air was filled with the sweet smell of rotting wood and the freshness of the nearby sea. We reached a small clearing where the remains of an old church stood. The windows had long since been broken and the doors hung crookedly on their hinges. "This is where we take a break," Mr. Johnson explained as he told us about the history of the fire that once ravaged the island. While the other students fooled around and took photos, Emily and I were magically drawn to explore the church. The interior was dark and smelled musty. Our only bright spot was the light from our cell phones. Emily pulled me towards the altar, behind which was a small, half-hidden passageway. "Come on, let's see where this leads," she whispered. Defiant and driven by a mixture of curiosity and fear, I followed her. The passageway led into an underground room that was so cold that every breath felt like a stab in the chest. The walls were covered with ancient frescoes depicting scenes of life and dramatic fire. Emily, mesmerized by the paintings, touched the cold wall and flinched. "Do you feel that?" she breathed. "The wall, it's vibrating." Suddenly, we heard footsteps above us. Slow, heavy, as if someone or something heavy was moving. We looked at each other, panic written all over our faces. "It must be one of the teachers," I tried to whisper, but my voice failed me. We heard the footsteps getting closer, heading straight for the entrance to our hiding place. The whispering grew louder, a voice, unintelligible but deeply disturbing. We pressed ourselves against the wall, unable to move, our breath freezing in the cold air. Then silence. Suddenly, no more footsteps, no more whispers. The oppressive silence enveloped us like a heavy blanket. Minutes passed in which each of us barely dared to breathe. Finally, with a courage I didn't feel, I pulled Emily back through the passageway with me, back into the daylight. We told no one about what had happened. What could we say? That we had heard voices and sensed an eerie presence? We knew no one would believe us. The rest of the trip passed without further incident, but Emily and I spent the drive back to the mainland in silence, each caught up in our thoughts about what we had experienced. Even now, years later, I wonder if we were really alone in that cold, dark room under the church, or if the ghosts of the past were trying to tell us something. The memory of Harper's Isle stays with me, a constant companion whispering that there are things beyond our understanding. Do you feel that tingling? That's the fear running through your veins. If you love the thrill and don't want to miss any of our scary stories, hit the subscribe button. It was a rainy October morning when the 12th grade class of Pine Ridge High School set out on a seemingly harmless field trip to the old Blackwood Asylum. The school was located in a quiet corner of Vermont, and the asylum was a local legend, an abandoned psychiatric hospital that closed in the early 1900s after reports of inhumane treatment and mysterious deaths went public. Mr. Green, the history teacher, had chosen this place to teach the students a lesson about the dark chapters of medical history. Believe me, you will learn more about human behavior today than any textbook could teach you, he said with a mysterious grin as the bus drove through the misty countryside. The students, including Sophie's best friend and her curious classmate Tom, were both fascinated and terrified by what they might discover. When the bus finally came to a halt on the crunching gravel path in front of the imposing, dilapidated building of the asylum, the atmosphere immediately felt heavy and oppressive. Remember, no vandalism and stay together. This place has a tragic past, warned Mr. Green as they entered the main building. The entrance hall was huge and covered in graffiti. Dust and cobwebs bore witness to decades of neglect. The floor creaked ominously under their footsteps. Sophie, Tom, and two other classmates, Jessica and Mike, decided to explore the upper floors, while the rest of the class stayed on the first floor. Armed with flashlights, they climbed the creaky stairs. Each floor was creepier than the last. Abandoned wheelchairs, broken windows, and peeling walls created a scene straight out of a horror movie. When they reached the third floor, they suddenly heard soft crying. "Did you hear that?" whispered Jessica. The crying got louder the closer they got to the end of the corridor. They cautiously approached the source of the noise, an old patient's room. The door was open. Tom hesitated, but Sophie, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, moved forward. There was no one in the room. The crying had stopped, but now they heard a different sound, a soft whisper coming from the shadows behind the door. Without thinking, Mike shone his flashlight there. In the faint glow of light, all they saw was empty air. "Maybe it was just the wind," muttered Tom, visibly relieved. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. Sophie cried out as the group instinctively backed away. "We have to get out of here," she said, and they all agreed, hastily leaving the room and the floor. When they returned to the others, the mood was subdued. Mr. Green noticed their pale faces. "What happened?" he asked. They talked about the noises and the door suddenly slamming shut. Mr. Green nodded gravely. "There are many stories about this place. Some say the souls of the patients are still trapped here," he explained calmly. The return journey on the bus was silent. Sophie, Tom, Jessica, and Mike sat together, no one talking much. Whatever they had experienced at the Blackwood Asylum, it would surely echo in their minds for a long time to come. The place's grim past had taught them an unforgettable lesson. Some places are better left unvisited. In the affluent school district of Fairfield, Connecticut, it was common for students at the local high school, Fairfield Prep, to go on regular educational trips. I remember the year I was in 10th grade and we took a particularly memorable trip to Old Salem, Massachusetts. This place is famous for its historic witch trials, and our history class was excited to learn more about this dark era of America. The trip was to last 3 days, and our escort consisted of 3 teachers and an intern who had just graduated. The bus ride took a few hours, and I sat next to my good friend Max. We had planned to share a room and were looking forward to the planned activities and free time afterwards. When we arrived there in November, the whole city was shrouded in a gray and cold weather, which only added to the mysterious atmosphere. Our accommodation was on the outskirts of the town, overlooking the gloomy forest that surrounds Salem. After a day of guided tours and visits to museums, Max and I returned to our room, which was on the first floor of an old wooden house. The room had a large window overlooking the dark forest. Despite the cold, we decided to leave the curtains open to let in the moonlight. What we didn't realize was that this would be the beginning of an eerie night. We tried to sleep, but the sounds of the forest and the feeling of being watched kept us awake. Around midnight, Max suddenly startled and screamed. Confused and frightened, I looked at the window and saw a figure coming out of the forest. A tall, gaunt woman with long, white hair was standing right in front of our window, staring at us with wide eyes. Without a word, she turned around and disappeared as quickly as she had come. We were too scared to look immediately and spent the night awake talking about what we had seen. The next morning we told our friends about the incident, but no one really seemed to believe us. The following day was filled with more tours and stories about the witches of Salem, but Max and I couldn't forget our encounter. Night fell again, and this time we made sure the window was firmly shut and the curtains drawn. But the peace didn't last long. Deep in the night, I woke up because I sensed something was wrong. I whispered Max's name, but he didn't answer. When I turned to check on him, the woman was there again. This time she stood at the inside of the window and whispered, "You can't lock up the past." Then she turned and walked back into the woods. Terrified, I woke Max and we decided to spend the night in the lounge, too scared to return. In the morning, we went straight to reception to tell them about our experience. The receptionist listened to us, but his reaction was strangely indifferent. He only said that we were not the first to have seen the Lady of the Forest. Full of questions and without any real answers, we set off on our journey home. This encounter in Salem made a deep impression on Max and me, and to this day I still wonder whether we witnessed a genuine paranormal phenomenon or whether it was just a product of the spooky stories and dark history of Salem. But one thing is certain, I will never forget this school trip. If you want to see more horror stories, check out my next video.